Hey guys, welcome to today's video where we're going to be making Christmas tree decorations. I made some test pieces just to see how my resin and dyes would work. Up here I have all of the different molds that I'm going to use, and this is what one of the final pieces will look like. There will be a lot less bubbles in the final pieces though, because I bought a vacuum chamber, so that'll help me remove them. The resin I'm going to be using to make them is Resin Art resin, and I bought some different foils to embed into it. I've got some gold, some silver, and some copper, so hopefully those will turn out looking good. Step 1 is to put on some safety gloves so that I don't get resin on my hands. My first attempt at making the ornaments was kind of a disaster, but I'll show it to you guys and I'll tell you what I did wrong at the end because I think it would be very helpful for anyone trying to recreate these ornaments. To start making the ornaments, I have to mix 50% of the resin with 50% of the hardener. I bought a bunch of these little measuring cups that have the volume markings on the side, so I'll use those to get the perfect 50-50 ratio. After the two parts have been mixed, I need to stir it for 3 minutes. After I finished stirring it, it was very milky and full of bubbles. So I next just added the copper foil in to see what that would look like. Once I added the copper flakes to the resin, I gave it a good stir to break the flakes up so they're in a bunch of smaller pieces and also to make sure they were mixed in with the resin really well. After I had everything mixed together, I poured it into the molds. I only ended up making enough to fill 2 molds with this batch though. Since I wanted to try and fill all my molds in the first batch and I had a 45-minute cure time, I also made a second batch where I just exact same resin mixture and I just put gold foil in this one to see if it would come out any different. The triangle mold was a giant pain to try and get the resin in, so I just ended up taking the resin out of it, putting it in a rectangle mold, and then just the leftover little bit I left in the triangle mold. Once I had all my molds filled with the resin flake mixtures, I transferred all of them into my vacuum chamber. Here's a bunch of snippets of what the resin did as I had it in the vacuum chamber. I got it down to about minus 23-ish inches of mercury, and then I just left it there. But you can see it really started to bubble up and foam as the bubbles started to come out of the resin. Once I pulled my vacuum, I left all of the resin molds in the vacuum chamber for 24 hours to see if they would harden up. After I released the pressure and took everything out of the chamber, I was surprised to see that even the triangle one that had only been about half full was filled all the way to the top. There were a ton of bubbles in all of them, as you'll see when I get them out of the molds. But yeah, that was very surprising. Demolding was a lot of fun. I found that the best way to do it was to stick a pair of tweezers down the side of the mold to break it loose from the resin, and then I could force it up and out of the mold. Once I got it out of the mold, I realized just how many bubbles were in this batch, which was surprising because I'd put it in a vacuum chamber, but I'll explain later why there's so many bubbles in this and exactly what I did wrong. Here's what it looked like when I got everything demolded. It was a complete mess, and they didn't turn out great, but that's okay. They were also really soft and bendy. After leaving them out just in the air for another couple days, I did notice that they hardened up a lot, so I don't think it properly cured in the vacuum chamber. What all went wrong with this run then? Well, number 1, I didn't remove the bubbles from the resin before I mixed in the metal flakes. The resin has a 45-minute cure time, so I could have easily done 2 runs in the vacuum chamber, removing bubbles twice. Number 2, I didn't release the vacuum on the molds after I applied it. Leaving the vacuum applied meant that there would normally be small bubbles, but they get really big because as you decrease the pressure, the volume of those bubbles increases. The third thing that I did wrong was I didn't pack down the flakes once I poured them into the molds, so there was a bunch of big holes that got left behind. Taking everything I learned from the first run, I moved on to my second run, which went a lot better. To start off this run, I mixed 50% of resin and hardener again, but this time I mixed a lot more so that I could at least get more than 2 out of it. After I'd put them together, it was time to give them a 3-minute stir again. Once I finished stirring, you can see just how many bubbles are trapped in the resin. Last time I didn't do anything to take these bubbles out before I put the flakes in, so that's why I ended up with a ton of bubbles in my end result. This time, I put just the resin into the pressure chamber and I pulled the vacuum on it to try and get all of these bubbles out. This was when I repressurized the vacuum chamber. I just thought it was kind of cool to see. After I'd repressurized it, I took the lid off and I could see that all of the bubbles had been drawn to the very top of the resin. So the best way to get rid of these bubbles was to take a torch and just put it over the top of the resin for a little bit and get all the bubbles out. After I hit it with the torch, you can see that a lot of the bubbles are gone and it's a lot clearer. So that definitely worked a lot better than last time. For this batch, I'm going to make them out of copper flakes, so now I added the copper. This part was the same as before. I just put a lot of copper flakes in and then I mixed it up to break them into little tiny chunks so that there wouldn't be a massive glob of copper in there. Once I had them all mixed together, I then put it back in the vacuum chamber again to get out all of the bubbles that I'd put in while I was mixing the copper flakes into the resin. Since I'd drawn a bunch of bubbles to the top, I hit it with a torch again. Once all the bubbles were gone, I then poured it into the molds that were the easiest to demold from, which was the hexagon and the square and the rectangle. And I also packed it down a bit with the popsicle stick I was using for stirring. This helped to get rid of all of the bubbles that had been trapped in when I poured the resin into the molds. I left everything out in the open for 2 days to try and get it to fully cure. I didn't want to put it into the vacuum chamber again because you saw last time that just means any bubble that's left in there is way bigger than it is if you just leave it out in regular air. These turned out really good though in the end. There's a couple of slight imperfections and holes, but overall I think they turned out great. Here's what all 3 of them looked like once I demolded them, and I think the metal flake in the resin, it looks really cool because it's really shiny and sparkly. Attempts number 3 and 4 went okay. Attempt number 3, meh. Attempt number 4, really good. I'll show you what those ended up being. Run number 3, you can see after I mixed the resin, there was a bunch of bubbles in it. It was the same as the other runs. It was just for this run, it was a little bit more of a factor. You can kind of see here why having a bunch of bubbles in the initial resin was a problem on run number 3. My hands were getting pretty tired because I didn't have an electronic vacuum pump. I just had a manual one, so it was a lot harder to get it to the pressure needed to get the bubbles out. Here was the end result of attempt number 3. They're not terrible, there's just a few more bubbles in it. The other thing that I did different was I had a different resin to flake ratio on these. I used a lot less flakes, so I think that left more resin to keep more bubbles in the end result of these. For run number 4, when I mixed it, I made sure to be a little less zealous in my mixing, just to try and get less bubbles into it right off the get-go. So it was a lot clearer when I was done mixing, and I do think that in attempt number 3 I'd overmixed. For run number 4, I wanted to see what 2 different flakes mixed together would look like, so I mixed copper and silver for this one just to see how it would look. After I'd mixed it all together, I threw it in the vacuum chamber again just to get all of the bubbles out that I could. For For attempt 4, I managed to have enough mixture to fill 4 molds, so I get 4 out of this. I ended up leaving these ones to sit for 4 days to harden just because I was busy doing other things, but when I finally demolded them, they turned out awesome. The 2 different colors of flakes worked really well together, and I would definitely do it again. I might try gold and silver next time though. Now that I had all of my different runs done, I needed to clean up the tops of them, because getting them out of the molds, there was little kind of bits where it flowed over the top of the mold, and it wasn't straight flush with the edge. Once I had all the overhanging bits removed, it was time to start sanding down the tops. For sanding, I'm going to go from 100 grit all the way up to 1500 grit, and the intervals are going to be 100, 150, 220, 400, 600, and then 1500. The reason I'm doing this sanding step is because the center of the top is a lot lower than the outside edges on all of them, so I need to sand down the whole top so it's all one big flat piece. After I'd sanded them for a bit, it's a lot easier to show the dip in the center of all of them. You can see around the edge, it's nice and white where it's been sanded, and right in the middle there's still a colored bit where the sandpaper hasn't gotten to yet. It took a bit of sanding, but I finally got all 3 sets of ornaments rough sanded, and then it was just polishing up the tops. After the rough sanding, I just made my way through the rest of my sandpapers. I slowly moved from doing just straight back and forth sanding to circular sanding so that I didn't get any pattern grooves in my final pieces. I also, when I got to the higher grit sandpaper, started using water just to help with the sanding process. After all of my sanding was finished, this is what the final result looked like. It's not completely as clear as the sides, but I think it's good enough for Christmas ornaments. The final thing that I have to do is put the loops onto these. So to start that, I first need to take this eyelet and screw it into the top of each of the ornaments. To get the eyelet started, I used Teflon tip pliers so I didn't scratch the eyelet, and then after I had it started, I just used my hands to finish screwing it into the top of the ornament. After I finished the first one, I did all the rest, and all the eyelets went in awesome. The next part was really tricky, and I had to fine-tune it quite a bit. First, I put a jump ring on the end of the chain that I'm going to use to make the loops. Then I had to dangle the chain down through the eyelet, because that was the easiest way to get it through it. And then I had to take the chain and put the end of the chain back onto the jump ring on the other side of the hoop so that both sides of the chain made a loop. Then I had to just close the jump ring and I was good to go. It took a bit, but I finally finished all of them, so now it's time to hang them on a tree and see how they look. And there we go. There's the tree with all the homemade ornaments on it. Now, there's not enough to do both sides, but that's cool. Let's see if we can get, you hold them up in the lights. They're kind of just dangling there. I don't have a steady cam, so sorry for any shaking, but yeah. There we go. These turned out amazing. Just sparkling there in the light. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a happy holidays, and I will see you in the next one.